Hello, fellow faith processors. Welcome to this week's episode of Faith in Process, the show where we explore how real people are actively processing their faith in their writing, in their work, and in their everyday lives. I'm your producer, Grayson Priest, and today, Harry will be speaking with Don Fitzkee about Don's upcoming article in Messenger magazine on positive changes to Brethren theology over the years. Enjoy the conversation.
Welcome to all of you faith processors in the room, and welcome to all of you out there that are processing your faith and listening to this podcast sometime perhaps during the week. My name is Harry Jarrett. I am the pastor here at Pleasant Valley Church of the Brethren at Weir's Cave, and this is Faith in Process Sundays Cool. I think that Sunday is cool and should be cool, and so I'm trying to work at that, and I'm trying to convince other people that Sunday can be cool. So this whole project is part of that effort. Today, I am joined by Don Fitzkee, who is the pastor of worship at Lancaster Church of the Brethren, and he is also the illustrious 2026 annual conference moderator. Don's conference theme this year is Imagine, which I'm super excited about. It is a call to reappropriate our historic commitments to radical discipleship, to focus on a New Testament center, caring community, humble service, and nonviolent peacemaking, all of which are very central Church of the Brethren themes and stuff that we've been working on for quite a long time. Don has served as the chair of the Mission and Ministry Board. Don previously ministered for 2 decades as a free minister, which for those who don't know quite what that is, that means you didn't get paid, right, Don?
Non-salaried, yeah.
Non-salaried, okay.
Non-salaried. Yeah. We made our living doing other things.
Yeah. Yes. And you served for those 2 decades in Chicky's congregation near Mannheim. And you also wrote a book called Moving Toward the Mainstream on 20th Century Change in the Atlantic Northeast Churches of the Church of the Brethren. So a lot of wonderful stuff. You were the editor of the Messenger magazine, which is a Church of the Brethren editorial magazine. And
I was not the editor of Messenger. I served there in Brethren Volunteer Service as an editorial assistant.
Editorial assistant. Well, I promoted you. I guess you could have ended up the editor. And now you're writing articles, and you've got this article series called Imagine That. And we're going to be talking about the article that you just wrote called I See the Change and the Improvement. And I'm going to let you talk a little bit about that article, where that came from. You engage with a lot of very thoughtful writers and people, maybe even know them, people like Richard Rohr, N.T. Wright, their vision for scripture, Brueggemann. So a lot of great stuff in that article. And one of the questions that you ask in the article is, how do we know when change actually makes us more like Christ? So today we're going to talk about those things, the stuff that you bring out in that article. Ask that question for ourselves and maybe a few more. So, Don, I don't know if I missed anything about you or for you, but feel free to add or detract anything that you'd like to do, and then we'll start talking about this article. I can see the change and the improvement.
Sounds good.
I guess the first question is, your opening line in this article is, I see the change, but not the improvement. Give us a little background on where that comes from. And then, since your article is titled, I Can See the Change and the Improvement, I'd love to start out by just hearing, where are you seeing changes that are improvements in the Church of the Brethren, or just church in general, the universal church, however you'd like to talk about that?
Yeah, so the intro to the article, setting up the whole idea of the article, there was a real-life conservative minister in our home congregation. When I was a youth, he was still preaching, Herbert Walgemuth. Good old guy. And there was a story told about Herb that some innovation came along. I don't remember for sure what it was. It might have been something as simple as a refrigerator. And he was wary of any kind of change. And he said, well, I can see the change, but not the improvement. And so that became a line that I've used different times through the years that, oh, I can see the change, but not the improvement. So it got me wondering in the church, obviously a lot of things have changed in the Church of the Brethren. The book that you mentioned that I wrote, Moving Toward the Mainstream, really was profiling all the many ways that the churches of here in Eastern Pennsylvania had changed primarily in the 20th century, going from being plain people to dressing much like everyone else, kind of just opening up to the world and being less separate and less set apart in many ways. So the article kind of looks at or raises the question of how do we tell which changes are improvements and which changes are not?
Mm-hmm.
And you can see I'm not wearing a plain suit this morning. So obviously I'm not longing for the days when we were still plain. I went through a stage when
not with that tie for sure.
There we go. It's my Christmas tie.
I can tell.
Yeah, there we go. I went through a stage when I was working on history and spending time in the basement of E-Town College's Zug Library, where they have pictures of all these old brethren, elders with beards down to here, down to their chest on the wall.
Yeah.
So I went through a stage where I had my little brethren beard, but I don't aspire to be that kind of brethren anymore. So some change seems positive and some less so. And the article kind of asks how we tell the difference between the two. Mm-hmm. So I think as I look at the Church of the Brethren, I think the evolution of our peace position in some ways has been very positive. At one time, we talked more about non-resistance than peacemaking, and we kind of defined it as what we didn't do. We did not go to war. We did not participate in even elections or running for office, and we were set apart. That was the other kingdom, and we're in the kingdom not of this world. But I think after World War I, we began to see we had some responsibility for being blessed peacemakers and working for peace in the world. And I think that has been a positive change in the life of the church. It would be one example of a change that is an improvement. Now, the other side of that is that when the brethren defined it largely negatively, most of our young men did not go to war when there was a war. Once we started accepting responsibility for making peace in the world, World War II came along, and fully 80% of brethren, men who were drafted participated in the military, and another 10% participated as non-combatants, and only 10% chose conscientious objection. So
a huge shift there, really.
Yeah, so there's some trade-offs there.
Yeah, I've been talking to Scott Holland, who is a professor emeritus at Bethany Seminary. We've had several conversations. The last one, I think it was, we talked about the whole shift between a just war theory and a just peace theory, and some of the work that he has done for many, many years on what does it mean to focus on a just peace, and what does that mean for us as Anabaptists or Church of the Brethren or whatnot. So it seems to be still a big conversation, really. I'm not sure that everybody agrees. I know in my congregation, for sure, there are a lot of folks that have participated in military service, are still participating in military service in one form or the other. And so navigating that and really trying to figure out what does it look like to be faithful, really, to be more like Christ in our current context. One of the things that you mentioned, or one of the persons you mentioned, was Richard Rohr, who is one of my favorite authors, has really impacted my life a lot of ways, and is kind of coming back into my sphere as I enter into a second season of life. Being 62, I'm not sure where you are in that arc of age, but you're not a college guy anymore. So I figured you might be embracing a second season of life as well. And you talk about that in this article about Richard Rohr's, this conversation about second half of life, how that impacts our understanding of Scripture and mystery. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Flesh that out for those of us that are listening or here today that, of course, haven't read perhaps the article. What is Aurora talking about, and why does that seem important conversation in the church right now?
Yeah. 62, that's my age as well. I turned 62 on Christmas Day.
Did you? I'm embracing 62, but I really don't turn 62 until January 17th. So
there you go.
So you're older than I am.
Yeah, there we go. The reference in the article to Richard Rohr was his book Falling Upward, and I discovered that book at a time when I was really part of the non-salaried plural ministry team at Chickies, and some of my colleagues were moving in a more conservative direction, and I was probably moving in a more progressive direction and trying to figure out where I fit in, if at all. And I actually stepped out of pastoral ministry for ended up being 9 years or so that I was not involved in pastoral ministry.
Interesting.
And, at the time when I stepped back from my role at Chickies, where I had spent the entire first, would have it been 45 or so years of my life at that point, most of those years.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
I mean, we call all our leaders from within the congregation. So many of our leaders were folks who grew up in the congregation, and that was me. So anyway,
I've
I was
never
trying to
been
figure out.
anywhere for 45 years.
Yeah.
At least not one place other than, sort of Earth.
Yeah, basically from 1963 until 2018, I was at Chickies, other than being abroad for a year and being in Brother Volunteer Service for a year and a half. That was my congregation.
That would be a whole conversation about what does it look like to be somewhere that long and minister that long somewhere. That's quite an arc just in itself. Sorry, diverging and a little ADD moment there, but that's fascinating, really. So
yeah,
back to Rohr.
And it becomes more fascinating then when you have a strong brethren identity and your congregation, the other leaders are moving away from that. They're viewing most of the changes taking place in the denomination negatively, and as a result, Chickies has now withdrawn from the denomination.
Yeah, so a lot of turmoil and trauma and pain and grief and remorse and all kinds of things, I would imagine there, right?
Yeah. So the Richard Rohr question, he was, one of the kind of the central premise of his book, Falling Upward, was that we all kind of have these two halves of life. It's not necessarily chronological, and not everybody ever even reaches the second half. Right. But in the first half, we kind of have a very concrete faith. We kind of have to have a foundation of kind of a simple understanding of faith. And then somewhere along the way, we begin to see things are a little more complicated than what we first believed, and things that we thought were black and white maybe are a little grayer. And so as we become gray, some of our thinking also becomes a little more gray and a little less black and white. So that book helped me at that time, helped convince me that maybe I wasn't losing my faith, but maybe I was moving on to a new stage of my faith understanding.
Yeah.
I've heard it told both ways. You could probably find some people who still think I was losing my faith, but I came to peace with that. I was thinking of some things in new ways.
Yes, I had a similar experience. I was very involved, I think I told you, as a pastor in Lancaster, very large congregation, really, Nessville Mennonite, and went through a similar faith journey progression and decided that it was time for me to step away, and actually stepped away for 13 years. And now I'm in my 16th month of renewed ministry. So I'm very much in that second half of life. I jokingly would tell people that I believe that things in the Bible are written black and white, and the black and white seems to have a lot of conversation about gray. So yeah, Rohr is a wonderful, helpful thought leader, I think, for all of us. One of the things you mentioned too, which I'm really thinking about a lot these days, is the whole idea of sola scriptura, which was a Reformation theme, where with the onset of the printing press, the Bible was written in common language and then was sent out, and then the church, at least a portion of it, had this big radical reformation or reformation, and the Bible and this idea of sola scriptura, and it became what some would call a paper pope, moving from the papacy to sola scriptura, or scripture only. That's certainly a theme that the Church of the Brethren picked up, right? Particularly the Gospels. And now there's sort of conversation about the authority of Scripture and what did Jesus really mean, and what was Jesus really leading us into. And that's going on in our church, and it's creating a bit of turmoil. How do you see your article and these thoughts of, I can see the change, but not the improvement, or I can see the change and the improvement? Do you have any thoughts on this sola scriptura and what typical brethren understanding of the Bible and Scripture is, and Is something changing? Is it not changing? If it's changing, what's good about it? Maybe what's not good about it? I've heard you speak, a little bit on this and write a little bit about it, but do you have any thoughts on that today?
Yeah, I mean, in the column, I talk about the traditional Brethren understanding of Scripture, that we understand the Old Testament in light of the New, and the New Testament in light of the example and teachings of Jesus. That we've always kind of had a different way of understanding Scripture than maybe some others who might view the Bible a bit more flatly than that, and be willing to kind of pull a verse out from the Old Testament and interpret it much the same way as they would pull a verse out from the Sermon on the Mount. And it talked about how different churches have different canons within the canon, that is, scriptures that are kind of central or interpretive keys for them. And for Brethren, it's been the Gospels, and I think especially Matthew, and within that, the Sermon on the Mount have been kind of key scriptures for us. And the article has a quote from N.T. Wright, the Anglican scholar, and he asks, what does it mean to appeal to the authority of Scripture? And he talks about how sometimes people say, we believe in the authority of Scripture, and that means that you can never change your understanding or your interpretation of Scripture because you're perceived to be abandoning Scripture. But he says to affirm the authority of Scripture is precisely not to say we know what Scripture means and don't need to raise any more questions. It's always a way of saying that the church in each generation must make fresh and rejuvenated efforts to understand Scripture more fully and live by it more thoroughly, even if it means cutting across cherished traditions. I like the quote that he's saying we can maintain our commitment to the authority of Scripture even as we raise questions about what the meaning of that Scripture is for us today. The Brethren like to talk about remaining open to new light, some of the early Brethren.
Yeah.
So I don't think the old Brethren were wishy-washy on what they thought about Scripture, but even as they had strong convictions and were even willing to suffer for their faith, they still wanted to be humble enough to say that, maybe we haven't understood all of this as fully as we could have, and we want to remain open to the Spirit leading us into greater understanding of what the Lord requires of us through the Scriptures.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it's important to recognize that if we think we know everything about God already, God's probably very small.
Yeah.
Right? So let's hope we don't know everything.
Right.
Right? Are you, either as the moderator or in your church, how are you working at that hermeneutic, that Christ-centered, the epistemology of how do we know what we know about God, and how then do we apply that? How do we determine whether or not what we knew was well-founded, or do we need to reimagine that, sort of using Brueggemann's prophetic imagination stuff? Or are we doing anything as the Church of the Brethren, broader church-wide or just, locally in congregations? Is anybody thoughtfully working at this to try to have good conversations around these things without getting too mad at each other and splitting from one another, so that, after those conversations, we can go out for a cup of coffee?
I mean, I think we all are in some ways having to work at it just because of the climate in which we live, the cultural climate and the climate in the church. But in terms of whether, I don't know that I have the great solution to the things that divide us. So I'm sorry, I have no revelation for you.
Why did I invite you?
For you today. Yeah.
We were expecting revelation. We were expecting Brueggemann,
So my annual conference theme is Imagine, as you mentioned in the intro. And it's intended to be a forward-looking theme based on the Joel passage quoted in Acts. In these last days, I'll pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and sons and daughters prophesy, young men see vision, old men dream dreams. So it's forward-looking. But then kind of the linchpin of the theme statement is a quote from Walter Brueggemann, who said that it's a prophet's job to help envision new possibilities. But then he says very often these new possibilities are not really new at all, but it's reimagining themes that have been important to us in the past, breathing new life into them, and things, he said, that are so old that they maybe have been forgotten. So I'm trying to have it both ways with my annual conference theme. It's a forward-looking theme, but it's going back to some very familiar-looking themes from our past, like peace and the New Testament as our creed and some of those sorts of things. And we're challenging the preachers to kind of look at these old themes and say, how has the meaning of these themes evolved, and what do they have that is new to say for our day? how does being peacemakers look different now than it did back in the day? What does it mean now to be a New Testament church that maybe was understood differently in times past? So we're looking back, but we're also trying to imagine something different than where we have been as stuck as a church in recent years.
So will there be any sort of forums of conversation where we actually try to practice this kind of work together?
Because we think the business agenda is a little lighter than it has been in recent years, we've actually carved out some time, taken one business session, and we're calling it a morning of sparking There's 3 S words there, but it's all about sparking our imagination.
Okay.
Then we have a keynote speaker coming in, and we'll have some Bible study as a part of that, some different insight sessions, and also some networking groups where people with common interests or common roles in the church will be able to get together and kind of share and kind of try to spark each other's imaginations and learn from each other what's working in their contexts and in their areas of work within the church.
Wow. Well, that sounds fun. Cool. Well, on that note, we agreed that since you, as well as I, have to go, you a little bit earlier than I, have to go to church and do worship, right? You have to leave at 10:05. So we're going to have to stop here in a little less than 10 minutes. I'm going to open it up to anyone here. Anybody want to ask a question or a comment? Grayson typically always does. So we'll get started with Grayson.
Hey, Don.
Hey, Grayson.
Earlier in your conversation, you'd been talking about how the Church of the Brethren has gone from a sort of non-participatory focus on peace, on being a peace church, to being more active in peacemaking, but how over that transition, also folks have become more active in, well, military service. How have you seen that sort of transition? Has that built more of a divide in the church, or how have those sort of worked together as the church has grown?
Well, I think our annual conference statements have been pretty consistent that, all war is sin, and we maintain the position that Christians should not engage in violence. But we've also been very open to say that we understand that not all Christians understand this the same way as our church has traditionally understood it. So there's a nice interplay there of whereas we continue to hold up the ideal, we also try to make room in the church for people who see things differently. And, we've done that on a lot of issues in the church where we state where we are, but we say we recognize that we're not all of one mind on this and make room for people who disagree. And obviously, the sexuality issue is the one issue that we have not figured out a way to do that people feel so strongly on that issue that we haven't figured out a way to keep together and keep talking and say, here's what the church believes, but we understand we don't all see it the same way. Did I answer your question in the midst of that somewhere?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, something else that I was wondering about. Both of you talked about this concept of there being 2 distinct stages in your faith life, of having a more concrete, I want to say simple faith, whatever that may mean for a particular person, and then sort of transitioning to a more complicated faith. I guess I feel like I have a little bit of a different experience from that, from being raised for part of my childhood in a church, but then not really connecting with that one in particular, and then sort of spending a few years out of it. And now I'm very active in the Church of the Brethren, but it still feels very complicated. So I guess I feel like that's been kind of my whole experience so far. Is that something
you skipped the simple stage?
I feel like I skipped the simple stage, yeah. I'm sort of curious if that, like other experiences in life, is maybe more of a comes in waves sort of thing, or has that felt like a very distinct 2 portions of life for you?
Yeah, I'm sure it's an oversimplification to say that, here's stage 1 and here's stage 2, and I went from the one to the other, and here's the clear dividing line. Here's the time when I stepped over from. It's obviously not that, but I think my experience has been, and I've talked with a lot of other folks, that as they've grown older, things that they would have been very black and white on, life gets more complicated for them. For a lot of brethren, divorce and remarriage at one time was the ultimate sin. But then somebody in their family or close friendship circles experienced divorce, and they had to wrestle with it on a personal level and began to soften their views a little bit, while still believing that marriage is a lifelong commitment. But what happens when that commitment doesn't last for a couple? Then what do you do? So yes, it's obviously not so simple as here's one stage, here's the other stage. But for me, at least, faith has gotten more complicated as I've gotten older.
That's fair. Well, so then in that context, what are some of the factors that have sort of spurred that for you, that really encouraged you to start I guess, looking into things more and having a more complicated relationship with faith?
Well, I think my divorce example, I think that there's kind of a general principle in there that as you become more engaged in issues and get to know people, it becomes more than just a simple doctrinal or something on a written page that this is right and this is wrong. When you actually have to struggle with real people that you know and love who are involved in the world, and even, world issues beyond individual things, when you start seeing the complexity and how individual people are impacted. Our church has been very much involved in refugee resettlement. So immigration is an important issue to me. And when on one level you can say, well, yes, there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. But when you actually just look at people's stories and the tragedies they're coming from and the need that they have for a place to make a fresh start in life, it's not just a straight legal issue. It's a human issue, that kind of thing.
Well, thank you. That's really helpful. I appreciate that. I will cede the rest of my time.
I yield.
Anybody else? Anything?
Yes.
John, you want to come up here?
Talk about starting over again in life.
Yeah, starting over again in life.
Pardon?
You're saying starting over again, the whole conversation about that?
Yeah, I did that 39 years ago.
Okay.
I drank alcoholically. I was doing that in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And quit alcohol 39 years ago. And I experienced it in childhood too with my dad. And swore to be damned I'd never turn out like him, but I did. And that terribly. But anyway, I quit drinking 39 years ago and couldn't do it myself. I tried several times. It didn't work. Alcohol had full control of me. Everything I did involved alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Everything. Now it's a different life. I go to AA meetings, and might disagree with me, but I see more spirituality in AA meetings than I do in church. I say spirituality, not religion.
Yeah. You're saying that at AA meetings, you see people that have a more authentic relationship with the divine, maybe, than maybe people who are in church and very doctrinal and biblical and fundamental, but it's sort of flat and like.
We talk about God, we talk about Jesus. God got us sober. God got me sober. I didn't do it myself.
Sure.
God did it.
I appreciate your sharing. Don does have to go, but I do want to give you an opportunity. I'm not sure how much you heard of that, Don, but really one person in here is talking about their experience with alcoholism and the spirituality and the experience of the divine and the support of the divine. In AA meetings, it's not necessarily religious, but it is a deep and profound and powerful experience of the divine and spirituality.
We talk about it AA, God. We find a God of our own understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody else's understanding.
Right.
He's God of my understanding, and I talk to him the way I need to.
So I know you have to go. I would love to get you to talk a little bit about that, because I think that there is a profound question and thing that we do need to talk about as church. Are we limiting the connection with the divine by our dogma and by our tradition and history and the walls that we make? And do we need to maybe learn something from other experiences or faiths or whatever and integrate that in a way so that church is cool and relevant and vital? But unfortunately, you got to go.
Yeah, I just heard bits and pieces with what the brother said, but it did remind me of more than 20 years ago, I went along with a parishioner to an AA meeting and had very much the same impression that there was more honesty. People were being more real there than we often are in church, where we covered up our problems and pretended that we were better people than we really were. And then, there you come clean right from the start when you introduce yourself and admit that you're an addict or an alcoholic. And we're not as open as that in our Sunday school classes and our places where we try to protect our reputations and look our Sunday best. So a little bit I was able to hear what the brother had to say. I kind of am agreeing with.
So you're going to need to fix
it. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
So now you know what you need to fix as a 2026 annual conference moderator, right?
There you go. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll get you back and talk a little bit about that. I think that would be an interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Don. I'll let you go. Thank all of you that came here and participated in this, and all of you that are listening online. We look forward to perhaps you joining us in the green room here at Pleasant Valley Church of the Brethren, or listening to this podcast. Time to go to church. Thank you, Don.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Faith in Process. Make sure you're the first to know when a new episode comes out by following us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you stayed this long, you might as well share this episode with one of your friends so you can continue the conversation. If you're interested in supporting the show or hearing the full, uncut audio each week, pledge a donation of just $5 a month on Harry's Substack. That's only the price of a cup of coffee once a month to support this meaningful mission and get access to nearly 20 minutes of pre-show conversation every week. As of now, those funds will go to upgrading our equipment and tools so we can record a cleaner show and reach a wider audience. That link is in the episode description. Curious what guests we have coming next? We are still reaching out to guests for the start of this year, but you can find our most up-to-date speaker calendar at the Faith in Process page linked in the description. That's also a great place to look if you're interested in joining us on an upcoming Sunday. Happy listening!